What he did and what he's known for is the most individual thing anybody could possibly do. What more personal thing could you do than use your own body in the way that he did? This is about, the most intimate kind of pain. And yet, very quickly, that intimacy, that personality, that sense of oneself is taken away and is turned into a slogan, a brand.
Okay, we're here with Tommy McKearney. Tommy, we asked you to go and see the film Bobby Sands 66 Days. And the reason why we asked you to go and view that film and give your opinions of it is that you yourself were on hunger strike in the first hunger strike, which ended up in the 10 died in 81, but you were on hunger strike in 1980 in the Mayor's prison.
Well, that hunger strike began in October of 1980 and lasted 53 days in the H blocks of Long Kesh, as we always called it. We very rarely used the term the Maze. It had came about gradually. It wasn't a decision that was taken overnight by any manner or means. And the long-term Republican prisoners were never going to accept the designation criminal. And it was more than just a fad. It was actually key to the political analysis of Republicans of the Provisional IRA. And it was obviously going to have an impact on the overall struggle if we, the prisoners, accepted the designation of criminal. So really one of the key issues for us was not to be seen, not to give the photo opportunity to the opposition to the British government, that is to portray us as ordinary run-of-the-mill criminal prisoners wearing prison uniforms, carrying out prison work, doing the normal prison regime. So it began really with refusal to wear the clothes, and at that then there's an escalation. Once you refused to wear the uniform, we weren't allowed out of our cells. We were non-conforming prisoners, breaking all the rules. That meant that we were confined to cell. Because of the nature of the H blocks, in spite of the fact that there was this propaganda piece put out by the British that these were very, very modern, well let off cells, there were anything but. And there was basically there was no in-cell sanitation, and the overwhelming majority, 96-97% of the prison officers were from the unionist community, and many of them, not all of them now by any means, but many of them were quite bigoted people. So to exercise the usual bodily functions, one had asked, well, there was either a chamber pot in a corner or has asked to visit the ablutions at the top of the wing, since there was no in-cell sanitation. And they started to refuse to allow us out, just bait men, and as a result, men first poured urine under the doors and then smeared excretion on the walls. That kicked off what we call the dirty strike, but we knew at a certain stage that this type of protest, we were confined to cell 24 hours a day. We had no clothes except rough grey prison blankets, like an army blanket. The furniture was all removed from the cell, so we were laying on a sponge mattress, and the conditions were deteriorating. Now, at no stage was there less than 50% of the Republican prisoners on protest, on the blanket protest. So we always had that bulk of the prisoners, but we knew that we couldn't continue with that type of a protest indefinitely. And when we had used whatever diplomatic channels we could through sympathetic politicians, both in the north of Ireland and in the Republic, and some in the States, even in Britain, they were running into a brick wall. The Catholic Church intervened. All of this was done on humanitarian grounds, not, I might add, in political support of the Provisional IRA, purely humanitarian grounds to bring an end to this deadlock. The Catholic Church was in Ireland. Cardinal O'Fee and his assistant Bishop, the late now Bishop Edward Daly, they again met with a brick wall. But I remember clearly when in August of 1979 the Polish Pope visited Ireland, and there was some, I at the time would have even then argued placed faith that the Pope might say something or make some useful intervention or intercession, he actually sided with the Tory government and used the very inflammatory phrase, murder is murder is murder, which was then repeated by Margaret Thatcher. At that stage we began to calculate that our options were seriously restricted, that we didn't have many options, and at that stage started to put in place the calculation that a hunger strike was becoming inevitable. Now, there were other initiatives, if you like, forlorn hope initiatives made. And this I have to give credit to Brendan Hughes, because Brendan Hughes always viewed the political situation in the prison as a specific, distinct issue, that it was a deadlock to be broken within the prison, that it was a prison issue, and that we were not viewing it as something in terms of the greater political, although we very clearly recognised the political implications of being criminalised, but we saw this as a prison issue, and Brendan wanted to try every possible means he could before resorting to the last option that a prisoner has, and that's the hunger strike. But our options run out. We decided then that we had no option but to opt for the hunger strike in 1980.
And Tommy, that decision to go on hunger strike, knowing the quality of mercy, if you like, of the British government at the time, knowing that it's quite possible, it's a good chance that you would die if you took that decision. How hard was that decision to make?
It was a difficult decision to make, but conditioned by the conditions we were living in. And now conditions, one within the prison, which were grim. And keep in mind that it wasn't just our physical surroundings, but also we were living with a very brutal regime. And there was ongoing and intense violence carried out against the prisoners by the prison officers day and daily. And that exacerbated the tension and the discomfort. But also keep in mind that this can't be isolated in terms of our thinking from the wider context. Now, we were talking about 1979, 1980. The Provisional IRA had been in action for practically 10 years. So in terms of our commitment, and those that were in the prison and their commitment, bear in mind that very few of them would not have had comrades who died in the conflict. Very few of them would not have had comrades in prison and relatives. So in many ways we were locked in almost a life or death struggle with the state. So on that basis, while it's not and wasn't easy to take the decision to go on a hunger strike with a distinct possibility that it would end in death, at the same time I think it's not the same as if we were coming out of the rarefied atmosphere of normal civilian life in a normal civilianised society where people get up in the morning and go to their work and come home in the evening and watch a football game or the soap operas. It was a very different atmosphere that we had lived in for the previous decade, and the history of Northern Ireland, where there was always the understanding within the Provisional IRA that, as I have one time before said, once you draw your sword on the Unionist regime and the British government, you do not expect anything other than the most intensive of struggles.
When you made that decision, I don't know whether you had a partner at the time, whether your parents were still alive or siblings, did you make that decision yourself, or did you discuss it with other people?
No, I made the decision very much on my own. It was my decision. Now, I was in the relatively fortunate position that I was single and I didn't have a wife or partner, so nor did I have any children. So in that sense, I was in a relatively privileged position that I only had my own personal outlook to think about. My parents were alive. I had siblings alive at the time. 2 brothers and 2 sisters were alive, and of course they were distressed, as you could imagine. And I remember very clearly that the visit that I took to tell my parents that morning, my mother was refused entry to the prison because she didn't have her identification with her, in spite of the fact that she'd been visiting for practically 10 years. But prison regimes are prison regimes, and they took every opportunity they could find to discomfort the blanket prisoners' relatives. But I remember having to tell my father and my sister, who was about 12 or 13 years of age at the time, and I had no option because we were only afforded one visit per month. It was what they called the statutory visit, which by law we couldn't be denied. So I had no option other than to go ahead and tell them. But I remember it was a heartbreaking moment, not only telling my father, but particularly my young sister.
You stayed on hunger strike for 53 days, I think it was. Nobody died on that hunger strike. Were you one of the first ones to go on it? And how did that hunger strike end up?
The 7 of us who went on the first, what we call the first hunger strike, although it's almost in some ways nearly forgotten about by now. That hunger strike, 7 of us started at the same time on the same morning. It was a Monday morning in October, and 18th, 19th, 20th of October, I just can't remember exactly the date. But I remember actually when it ended was the 18th of December, but we all began at the same time, and there was 6 members of the Provisional IRA, one of whom was myself, and the other member of the INLA, John Nixon from County Armagh, which is something that's sometimes overlooked, is that the INLA played a big part in that hunger strike and the subsequent hunger strike, and it's regrettable that that's very often overlooked. We began at the same time, and then the human body is a remarkably sophisticated piece of equipment. There is no computer, no matter how expensive, that comes remotely close to the sophistication of the human body. The human body starts to degenerate from the least important to the most important. So fat, whatever fat would have been on us, and there wasn't a lot after a number of years on the blanket protest, but it takes through the fat, it takes through the muscle, then it goes through the various organs until eventually, that's everything else being equal, it will eventually go for the heart and brain, the two most vital organs in the body. But we were all at the time men in our 20s. I think Brendan might have been, Hughes might have been 30, Tom McPheely might have been 30, but we were young, healthy, fit men in every other sense. And hunger striking, in my opinion, is a very Darwinian process. The bigger, heftier, stronger, younger human being is, the longer the last. There's no other way out of it. And we didn't show any great symptoms of deterioration for 25, 30 days. But after that, our friend Sean McKenna, started to go down quite rapidly, and I remember it was the 45th day when I noticed a rapid deterioration. On the 45th day I found that I actually, while giving a urine sample, I fainted. I remember coming around, I was being lifted into the bed in the hospital. My eyesight had faded, one eye was going blind, and I deteriorated quite rapidly after that. Effectively what was happening, and I didn't know at the time, was that the enzymes that the body naturally produces to break down your food, if your kidneys start to gradually fail, that the normal process of discharging the waste through enzymes mixed with food, part circulates through sucked out by the blood and reinforces the body. The rest of it will be discharged normally bodily functions, feces or urine. But if that doesn't happen, then really the enzymes start to actually create an acid which will then be absorbed through the bloodstream, which has an effect that I can remember. They're poisonous, almost a poison going through the bloodstream, so you have the same effect almost as if it was, it's almost like a hangover where the bloodstream is affected. So I started to get headaches and nausea and intense nausea, and then bit by bit hallucinations, and piece by piece I started to lose lucidity, and that was the process. So as the hunger strike was coming to an end, although I didn't know it, I was having periods of unconsciousness, periods of lucidity, periods where I was bordering on the hallucination because of the poison simply coming through my system. And it was at this stage that on the 53rd day that Brendan Hughes decided to call the hunger strike off. There had been discussions on the 45th day, just before I my health slumped significantly, and this is where ambivalence, uncertainty arises, because Brendan had to make a calculation, and this sometimes is overlooked. Brendan Hughes knew that if someone died on a hunger strike, at that stage all bets are off. The British calculation would have been quite pragmatic, realpolitik. That, okay, the provisionals, you've had your martyr, you've had your huge funeral, you've had your international publicity. We're not now going to give you political concessions on top of that. So if there was the possibility of a deal, Brendan knew, one, that to let someone die would not only be a futile loss of life, but he would also lose the possibility of the concessions being enacted, because the British couldn't possibly be seen to respond, and why would they? So that was the terrible dilemma he had been left within, and I think that is overlooked, underestimated. But on the belief that there was a deal in the making, Brendan called the hunger strike off. Now, I only found out about 2 hours later, because Brendan had called Sean McKenna, my friend, was on the verge of passing away. I was seriously ill. I found out later from the medical authorities in the prison that they were estimating between 24 and 48 hours that I had left to live. I didn't realise that at the time, because I was in no position to make any type of an accurate assessment anyway. Things were happening. For example, my parents were allowed in to give in the last week they got a daily visit, and then they were getting 2 visits twice a day. And I thought, in my misguided form, I thought this was some enlightenment that had arrived at the prison authorities. I didn't realise that it was because of my physical condition. But Brendan had convened the other 4 actually. Sean was totally unconscious, was on the verge of death. I would have been following after that. Brendan brought the other 4 men together and said that he was going to end it, but they were sitting around in one prison hospital cell, and when the prison medics come to give me medicine, which we were refusing, and they said to me, "Do you not realise that this has been called off?" And I wouldn't take their word. I insisted that only Brendan Hughes would give me that word, so they actually brought Brendan in on a wheelchair. Brendan said, "Yeah, go ahead, we've called it off." And it was another maybe 24 hours before I was in a position really to talk about it. So in some ways, when people put to me, what exactly was there, what exactly was happening, did he get this, did you get that, I can't put my hand up and say yay or nay, for the simple reason I wasn't compass mentis. Yeah.
Has it left any long-term effects on your body?
I have to say that I have been very fortunate, very mild, what they call stigmatosis, that under certain conditions my eyesight wavers. It's a little bit like in the old televisions. We don't have it anymore. The old television where the horizontal hold went a little bit occasionally, but by and large, and that's 35 years ago now, I have to say that I've recovered remarkably well. Some didn't, but I think I have to say I've been very fortunate.
Just moving on to the film, obviously you were in prison with Bobby Sands, so you knew Bobby Sands. Just generally, what was he like as a man?
A remarkable person in a lot of ways, because he seemed and did have the most enormous range of interests. Self-educated in many ways, but a man that had a huge interest in a huge range of topics. He had read a lot of poetry. He was a fine singer. And had a very distinctive voice, and some songs that I hear now, not so often, because music evolved so rapidly. I mean, he didn't go in for rap or whatever we have nowadays, but songs like Linda Ronstadt's "Different Drum," he used to sing that, and a few other songs, some of the Leonard Cohen ones.
He wrote songs himself as well.
And he wrote songs himself. He wrote songs. He would sing. He wrote songs. He wrote "Back Home in Derry," that has been recorded by Christy Moore. And he also wrote another song that Christy recorded, Michael Hatton, the poaching maker from the Glens of Antrim. Bobby was in the cell with a lad called Malachy Carey. Malachy was from Lochgeel, and poor Malachy was assassinated after he was released. But Malachy told the story of Michael Hatton, the poaching maker. So Bobby made up composed
so
the
it's
song.
actually about a real person.
Oh, it was about a real person, and Bobby then gave the words to Brendan McFarland. Brendan was the composer of music. Brendan put it to music, and somewhere along the line, the music and the words were presented to Christy Moore, who recorded it. But he wrote poetry, and the thing about it was that he wasn't, because of the nature of young men in prison. I mean, Bobby wasn't treated as the icon that he has become, and Bobby might write a poem, read it out the door, because we were all confined behind the doors, so he had to get up and he'd say, I have a new poem, read it out. And of course, being partly there's a particular type of Belfast humour. Half the contingent were Belfast men, so Bobby would read his piece of poetry out, and you'd always be 2 or 3 of them saying, rubbish, rubbish, rubbish. And of course he passed no remarks because he knew what they were at, and then he'd get himself exercised over something else. But he definitely was a larger than life personality on the wing, and spoke Irish, taught Irish, because Irish, there used to be Irish classes, and of course, as was recorded in the film, he occasionally would do a book or something out the door, tell the book, a story was told out the book or a film. And he was effectively, for the time I was with Bobby on the wing, he was Brenton Hughes' adjutant. That's the number 2, second in command to Brenton. But very often he would have organised the wing. Bobby organised the visits, because since we only got one visit a month, we wanted to make sure that there was at least, as best we could, get one visit a day going out from the wing to keep us up to date as far as we could. So Bobby would try and organise that. I remember one time he organised a visit for me, and I remember him shouting down as the screws come around the doors, taking the names of your visitors. I remember Bobby shouting down to me, put a visit out for Danny Morrison. And I said, okay, screws come out. I said, Danny Morrison, and give the address on the Falls Road. And I still remember shouting up, who the hell's Danny Morrison? And he shouted back to me, Bangers. And I said, Bangers. I didn't even know him by his proper name. So things like that. He used to do that, and then of course he organised what we call the education classes. Now, education classes were very much the prescribed agenda. The world as the provisional IRA saw it. So I was entrusted usually with those, and we would run that out, our views on. But bear in mind, we had no books, we'd not, so I or whoever was doing it, I usually done the history and the political economy, for which I was accused of being out of line with out of line with head office.
So from what you tell me, Bobby was very popular among the other prisoners.
He was very popular. He was in a wing about 40 men. There always would be 3 or 4 or 5 outstanding characters. Some of them were, if you like, wits. Had a smart aleck comment, a wise crack, no matter what would happen, no matter what the situation, good, bad, or indifferent. Bobby was slightly different in the sense that he was certainly popular. He was central to the organisation of life as it was organised by us from behind the doors on the wings, and even down to small things like smuggling in tobacco. Bobby always believed that he could think best if he could get a cigarette. Now, bear in mind that we were talking here about a small sprinkling of tobacco, very often rolled up on the page of the Bible. The British were always very good at that. Every cell had to have a Bible, no matter what else. Had everything else gone except the Bible. And by law, by the unwritten constitution of Her Majesty's government, we had to have a Bible. So we tore the paper, put a bit of tobacco that were smuggled in, Bob always reckoned that he could think best if he had a smoke. Now that was maybe one every couple of days, and it was a job in itself to get it lit, because we had to light them from a flint, and it was a flint and a wheel of a lighter, and you dropped it onto the wee bit of cotton wool that you tore out of the blanket, and that would go. So he used to do that, but he was always trying to organise. Now, he wasn't the only one that organised the tobacco, but he helped organise the tobacco in different bits and pieces like that. But it was central to the organisation of it. That he was always, others as well, but he was one of those that always had a scheme or a plan, or there was something that Bobby was working on. And by the way, I mean, we never called him Bobby. We only ever called him Robert. Robert, his name in Irish.
Oh, right.
We always addressed him as Robert. Hi, Robert. Yeah. We used the Irish of his first name.
The film that you just seen, Bobby Sands, 66 Days, does that to Bobby Sands justice?
In the broadest sense, I think it's certainly a tribute to Bobby Sands. And it doesn't do Bobby an injustice by any manner or means. And I think from the film we do see the battle he waged, the enormous battle he waged. We come to realise that it wasn't that it wasn't something he took on lightly, that he knew what he was facing, and that he faced up to it. I think that emerges from the film. It portrays the day-by-day endurance of Bobby. It shows the iron in his will. So all of that, yes, all of that I think is very positive, and I think it leaves a message that here was someone that was a very significant figure in the recent history of Ireland, possibly even in terms of the 20th century Ireland, certainly the second part of the 20th century. Bobby Sands is one of the outstanding figures. Whatever political view people take of it, a significant figure, and the strength, the iron will, the courage to do it, and the circumstances in which he was. Overall, though, I'm not so sure that I find the film itself a little bit unsatisfactory. I think there's not so much that what has been said in the film is actually wrong, but I think there's a lot left unsaid, and I think that's the main thing. The film leaves a lot unsaid.
We actually interviewed quite a number of people who had just seen the film. Most people gave the impression that it was an important film, a well-made film, well-edited film, and a lot of people thought it was fairly balanced, but there was a couple of sticking points. One was the inclusion of Fintan O'Toole as the commentator throughout it, and basically what he was saying. A lot of people had a problem with that. Did you find that?
I mean, I'd have an enormous problem with what Fintan O'Toole says, more or less at any time, but certainly what he said about Bobby Sands. Look, the film began, and having said that, yes, it shows the strength and iron of Bobby Sands and places him correctly and properly at the centre of the political history of the last 30 years of the 20th century in Ireland. But the film begins by talking about post-partition. There was tension between Catholics and Protestants. And I find it an extraordinary way to describe what happened in Northern Ireland from 1920 to the end of the century. Tension. Good Lord, tension. There's tension between the Israelis and the Palestinians. There's tension between the Ukrainians and the Russians. There's tension. That is not how I remember Northern Ireland. There was also, without putting into context this head count of how many deaths and how many were the responsibility of the Provisional IRA. I mean, you can quote statistics, endless statistics, but I think they have to be broken down before they become meaningful, and I don't think that they were taken and broken down properly. And also I waited to hear other voices. We had the British voices, who were understandably hostile, critical. We had the academics, who were academics, God help us. And then, of course, we had Sinn Féin. But the National H Block Committee, and I would have expected to have heard from Bernadette McCalliskey, Kieran Allen was on the National Health H Block Committee, still alive and well. There was no member of the IRSP or INLA. Jerry Brannigan was on the original National H Block Committee. Jerry Brannigan visited the H Block prisoners every day while we were on the blanket. Jerry's alive and well. Didn't hear from Jerry Brannigan. Perhaps they didn't. They refused to participate. I can't say whether they did.
The director did say that he asked members of the Sands family, Bobby's sisters, to take part, but they refused. But he said they have refused since I think they took part in lent a hand in a book that was written in 1984, and they haven't participated since. He also asked Bernadette, and Bernadette refused. He didn't say why. But like a lot of people who actually saw the film and we interviewed were active in the HBOC committee, and they were very disappointed that there was no mention from them. One other point that was made was there was no women at all in the film.
Well, yeah. So a lot. I found that in itself unsatisfactory. Now, my position on Richard O'Raw's contribution, Richard O'Raw's queries, I actually have questioned Richard's interpretation of the deal, or the ostensibly what was the deal. I've questioned Richard's interpretation of that, but Richard was interviewed, but all he was allowed to say was the piece about Bobby doing a story out the door. Now, I don't know whether Richard didn't elaborate on that, but I would have thought that certainly that would have been raised. So whether, I mean, as I say, I don't know who refused to take part. I know the Sands have had a long-standing position of not taking part in these things, but there were other members of the National H Block Committee. Bernadette may well have refused, but as I say, I don't know. I mean, names such as Kieran Allen, like Kieran Allen is accessible. He may have refused, I don't know. Jerry Brannigan in Belfast is accessible. Jerry come up every day to see us. He was key to the POW department, the Prisoner of War department as we called it. Now, again, Jerry Brannigan may have refused, but there is the niggling suspicion in the back of my mind that all of those people would have perhaps been critical of Sinn Féin.
Okay.
Maybe, I don't know.
As a filmmaker, he has to take into account a balance to the show. Like a lot of people said he managed that he succeeded in getting a good balance there. Now, besides what you've obviously said, there was missing voices that should have been there that weren't there. But do you think in general that he got the mix right?
In a BBC type of balance, where we had the British coming through, where we had the Yanks coming through, where we had Sinn Féin coming through, where we had the Free State government telling us why they could do nothing about it, Sean Donnellan, the man who also refused to support any clemency for the Birmingham Six or the Guildford Four, interviewed. Yeah, there was that, if you like, that BBC type of balance. Yeah, it had BBC balance.
A lot of people had a problem. Fintan O'Toole started and finished the film, but he surmised Bobby Sands' life as being the start of the peace process. Do you concur with that?
I don't actually buy into that. Certainly, there was if you like, it's a seminal moment when we see Sinn Féin beginning to emerge. That arguably could be described as the beginning of the peace process. A lot more than the rise of Sinn Féin, because this is making a case that that this could have happened by following normal electoral parliamentary politics. I don't subscribe to that entirely. There comes a stage when, yes, the various protagonists will sit down and talk. That doesn't always happen, but in this case it did. But to what extent they would have talked without the provisional IRA campaign making Northern Ireland ungovernable is another question. There is a certain tendentiousness about O'Toole's interpretation of that, and it's there's a self-serving argument that runs along the fault lines that has been employed for many years by the Dublin government, by the British government, that we could have all sat down 50 years ago and talked this out, if only. And on that basis, certainly O'Toole's phrase that this ended the armed struggle, and the Republicans then realised it was better to win the imagination of the people rather than killing people. Again, if only that was what was necessary, and that is a very, again, tendentious narrative to put out. It's very much the Irish Times, Irish Independent narrative of politics, which I don't buy into for a moment.
Somebody, I can't remember who, someone that we interviewed afterwards made the point that it appears by looking at the film that Bobby Sands woke up one day and decided he was going to join the IRA. But there was no context to that. Obviously, he made a decision at some stage in his life to join in the armed struggle, but there was no context to that. Absolutely no context.
Well, presumably then it was the tension that had been existing in Northern Ireland since 1920. I mean, that's where at the outset, talking about tensions between Catholics and Protestants in Northern Ireland, which then will lead into that, if that's the narrative that's being supplied, it will lead into Bobby suddenly deciding one morning, or anybody else deciding some morning, that there is no context, there is no background to a situation. Now, they did refer to riots and burnings in 1969 and the Sands family being forced from their home in Rathcoole and having to find a new home in Rathcoole, a unionist, strongly working class unionist area in the north of the city, and having to find a new home in Poleglass. But it did not set a context, because, as I've said to you earlier in this interview, that the calculations and the psychology that drove men to go on hunger strike to the death didn't come about just because they wanted a pair of Wrangler jeans to wear in place of the jeans supplied by the prison service. It wasn't a fashion statement they were making. It wasn't even their experience through the 10 or 15 years that had preceded the hunger strike. But we're talking here about a folk memory that's at least as old as the foundation of the Northern State, and quite possibly in the 6 counties, where you're talking about Belfast, where for many years effectively the Catholic population of Belfast, for good or ill, was held hostage to the good behaviour of their fellow religionists in that part of Northern Ireland, where violence was visited upon them on a regular and frequent basis throughout the years of that state, when there was a move for a democratic enhancement of the situation, that come together to manifest itself in the ironed willed decision to go on hunger strike to the death, that has to be taken into consideration, and it can't be explained away in some flippant way that as tensions.
Another point O'Toole made was, or implied was, that the whole hunger strike was a staged event, choreographed event. Now, I noticed when you were talking about the first hunger strike, 7 years went on hunger strike together. Now, obviously, that tactic changed for the next hunger strike, where they staggered them out. So, was it staged? How was it choreographed, or how much thought went into the whole proceeds of it?
There was considerable thought. Now, the original hunger strike, which I participated on, 7 people, and it was no accident that we selected 7 men, because it echoes the 7 signatories of the proclamation. It also, by the way, traditionally is the 7 makeup of the Army Council of any IRA is 7 people. But we strategically selected people from across, as best we could, across the 6 counties to enhance the impact of it. The second hunger strike, and there's differences of opinion about how it was brought about, but there was a thinking that while the 7 hunger strikers, all starting on the same time, put excessive pressure on all of them, because with one man approaching death, that the others had to take a decision whether to go ahead or not. that if one man started and a fortnight or 3 weeks later, I can't remember the exact number of days, but that meant that it was his decision and his alone whether he would stay or not, because the people following behind were coming at a distance. Now that was the thinking. So that was undoubtedly a rationalisation that was thought through. It wasn't any accident that people come on and it's in a staggered process.
I think Fintan O'Toole actually made the point that Bobby was making art while he was doing this. I don't know what you made of that comment.
That's outrageous. That's outrageous, to be quite honest. Others may interpret it as such. A Terrible Beauty is Born can be spoken of by Yeats or others, but those that died in Dublin in 1916 were not thinking of terrible beauties. It was a terrible calamity to the individual and their families. Bobby was involved in a life or death struggle, and he didn't choose to die, because this was not a suicide pact. At all stages, the desire was to have a solution that men could live in the prison. And just to be perfectly correct, the last scene in the film, which says 3 days after the hunger strike, it took a lot longer than that. The conditions were not granted 3 days after the hunger strike. One of the key demands, the right to work, really only came about after the big escape in September of 1983, which was a long time after the end of the hunger strikes, and then only because of security considerations within the prison, not in any connection with the hunger strikes at all, but purely because the prison authorities decided it was far too risky to allow that many provisionals access to the workshops in the prison.
Just in general, the film is very heavy on archive footage. Did it bring a tear to your eye? Did it bring you back in time?
While the hunger strike was happening, I was in a cell with no television, no radio, no newspapers, no books. So people tell me about songs and films and bits and pieces. This is all new to me, for the most part. But the names and the faces are all too familiar. All too familiar.
Would you recommend people go see it?
Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah, go and see it and critique it if you must, and critique it, please do, but yeah, go and see it.
Tommy, thanks very much.
Cheers, sure.
I am a political prisoner. I am a political prisoner because I am a casualty of a perennial war that is being fought between the oppressed Irish people and an alien, oppressive, unwanted regime that refuses to withdraw from our land.